In a previous video, we've created this first test that asserts that the object returned by calling database manager make method is of the instance of database. We have returned simply new instance of SQLite class, but as you may know, because we are extending database, that's why we can test it for basically instance of the class that it extends. We could also check the same way if it was implementing any interface, then we could check if it's instance of this interface. But in our example, we are only extending the database class, and that's why we're testing for this. And this would apply to any other driver class that we will be writing. So basically creating a class, the test that actually tests for the class that all of them actually will extend is a little bit better than writing test every time we are actually going to create a new implementation. Okay, so we've got this test. Let's now go back to our SQLite, because obviously at the moment this class is of no use to us. It doesn't do anything. It's just a blank class, the same about a database. Inside of the abstract database class, what we are going to do is create a protected property called PDO. And it will be, if I just put the doc block above, an instance of PDO object. And I'm just going to import it, so use PDO. And if we go back to our SQLite class, inside of this SQL class, I'm going to create the constructor. So new constructor, and this constructor will take two arguments. The first one being the name of the database, so we just call it database. And the second one will be of the array type and will be called options. And let's just update doc block. So we've got params added here as well. Okay, inside of this constructor, what I'm going to do is instantiate this PDO object. So PDO equals new PDO. There we go. And it will take 4 arguments. The first one being a data source name. So SQLite is the type of the database we're going to be dealing with. Colon, and then we are going to concatenate it with the database name. Then second one is the username, so we set it to null, password set to null as well, and this is because SQLite does not use username and password. We simply write permissions to the file, basic database file, and that's it. And then the last one will be the method. We're going to call the method, which we create in just a moment, called construct options, and then we're going to pass our options argument through. And let's obviously semicolon. After all this, let's import this PDO as well, so we have it right above the class definition. So that's our SQLite class construct completed. Let's now go back to the database. And the first thing before we create this construct options method, I'm going to actually create protected property called default options. And for default options, we are going to create an array. And this array will contain PDO constant called attribute error mode, so ITT or underscore error mode. Then we're going to associate PDO, another constant error mode exception. What does this mean? Every error converted to the exception, in other words. So we want to deal with the exceptions. We don't want to handle errors. We just want to deal with the exceptions in the exception way. Okay, so that's it. Let's just add the doc block here. Again, this is an array, so that's fine. And this will be always part of the options, the fourth argument for the PDO object instantiation, because this construct options will basically append to it. So if we just copy the name of the method again from SQLite, we can now create this new protected, because we obviously need to have access to this method from within the classes that extend it. And then it will take one argument, obviously, array options, which by default will be an empty array. Okay, and now what we're going to do is check if empty options, then all we're going to return is this default options array. So that's all we're going to return. But if it's not empty, then we are going to create a new variable called new options, which will basically be a copy of this default options array. So it becomes an array, obviously. And now what we want to do is to merge this array with this one. Now, the only problem with array merge, which is what we could use, is that these constants, if I click on that one, you'll see it represents the numerical key. And when we do an array merge with numerical keys as indexes of the array, they will not be overwritten. So any item, if we wanted to overwrite this item, for instance, with anything else, then we wouldn't be able, because they are numerical values. That's why we need to use the for each statement. So let's use the for each options s key equals option. And what we're going to do here is basically new options and then key equals option. Obviously, this time, if we were to use the same constant name for the key when we're passing the options as an argument, then it would overwrite it. With array merge, it wouldn't, it would append to this array. And this way, obviously, as I'm saying, we could overwrite any key, whether it's a string or numerical value. Okay, so now the last thing that we need to do is simply return new options, and that's all. So now this fourth argument here, constructor options, will take the second argument, which is of the array type, and it will merge it with default options, or potentially override anything that's within the default options property by default. So now the last thing we need to do is to generate the doc blocks, so we know what params it takes and what it returns as well. And let's put some description: merges, merges constructor options. There we go. So that's all done. If we now go back to our terminal, we've modified quite a bit of code here. So let's run PHP unit, see what's happening, and we have an error. It says that database manager test returns database instance method missing argument 1 for SQLite constructor. And that's right, because what we're doing at the moment, if I go back to our code, our editor, we've modified the SQLite. We've added the constructor, which requires the first argument to be present. It doesn't have any default value, but our database manager only calls the SQLite, creates the new instance of the SQLite without passing anything through. We could obviously put something statically here, let's say database, even something like this. If we go back to our terminal, if we refresh, basically run the PHP unit again, and that will return green, everything's fine. But it's obviously not right. I'm just going to clean this terminal window here. That's not how we want this to work. We want this to be more dynamic. We want to be able to basically specify what database we want to use and what credentials potentially it should use from within this .env file. So let's now focus on this database manager. What we are going to do here, we're taking two arguments. These options will basically be passed as a second argument to this constructor, which will then be passed to the PDO constructor. But the driver will indicate which database connection we want to use. So what we are going to do, rather than returning this SQLite here, we're going to start with if is null driver. Then what we are going to do is override this variable driver. So now driver argument will become .env. We're using this .env package, get method on it to get the specific value associated with the environment variable which we've declared inside of the .env file. And this one is called db_connection. So if we don't pass any driver through, if we don't strictly declare which driver we want to use, check the .env file db connection. In this case, it's MySQL. But as you may remember, when we're looking at PHP unit XML file, our configuration, we are overwriting this while we're testing to SQLite. And then database, we overwrite to memory to run all the tests on database in memory rather than using any files. So we are now using this if we don't specify strictly which driver we want to use. But if the driver has been specified, what we want to do is return, actually, either it's been specified or not, we are going to call the given method. So return call user func, and now we need to specify where callable instance. In our case, is going to be new static, referring to our database manager, to itself, in other words. We create new instance, and then method on this instance driver. So basically, whatever's going to be associated with this variable, it's going to represent the method name. And then what we want to pass through as an argument is options, the second argument we pass to this make method. Okay, obviously, if we try and test it again, it's going to still tell us that we have a problem here, because obviously call user func expects parameter to be a valid callback. Class database manager does not have a method SQLite, because we in a test mode, it automatically picked whatever DB connection value it has associated with it, rather than taking the live environment here. But it's not a live environment, but basically directly from the .env file. Okay, so it tells us that SQLite method does not exist. Let's quickly create this method. So we're going to create protected static method called SQLite, and it will take array options again, because that's what we're passing through to this call. And let's stop here and let's create straight away another one, protected static function MySQL. So we cover both of them straight away, array options and then empty array. Okay, so now we have the array. Let's quickly go back to our terminal PHP unit. Now we have different exception, the different error here. Basically, database manager make did not return instance of database. So basically, we going back to where we were in a previous video, where while we were calling this make method on database manager, we didn't get the database instance. So what we need to do now is return new SQLite, which is what we did previously, but now we are going to pass the arguments. The first one will be .env get, and we take in the db underscore database instance, basically name of the database, rather than semicolon, comma, and then options as the second argument. Options, there we go, as the second argument. So now if we go back to SQLite, you can see database name is the first argument, second is this options that is passed later on through to this PDO class, basically this instantiation of the PDO object. And if we go back, so that should presumably solve the problem with the test. If we go back, clear the screen, PHP unit, and there we go. Test passes. But now it actually uses the proper code, the code that we are going to be using in the production environment, in other words, in live environment. So it does return the SQLite instance where we automatically instantiate the PDO. So all this is passing. Now let's do straight away the MySQL one as well. So MySQL, rather than actually doing this first, let's open MySQL and let's start with this one. We're going to create the constructor here as well. So let's create new constructor, and the constructor will take quite a few arguments here, so we're going to split it into separate lines. Database is going to be the first one. Second one will be host, which by default will be 127.0.0.1, which is a local host, in other words. Then we are going to have port, which by default will be 3306. Then we are going to have username. Then it's going to be a password, quite a few arguments as you can see. And then the last one will be options. And it's going to be an empty array to start with. Let's create the dog blocks, update dog blocks rather. There we go. So all these params are now listed there. And the next thing is we're going to do is to do exactly the same as we did in the SQLite class constructor, which was instantiate the PDO object. So new PDO, but this time we're going to have quite a few options. We're going to have this username and password added to it, and the first option will be MySQL : and then DB name equals. Actually, let's use double quotes so we can put the variables directly in within the string, and I'm going to wrap them with the curly brackets. So database, and then we have : host equals, and in between a curly brackets, host, then colon, port equals, and port. And after this, comma, and then we go for username, second argument, password, third argument, and this construct options. But instead of passing the options straight away, I want to add one option to these options automatically when we're dealing with MySQL. So what I'm going to do is create another method, which I'm going to call straight away here, called Parse Options. And then I'm going to pass options argument to it. So this is going to be the constructor. Again, I'm going to import this PDO here, so it's above the class definition. And let's now create this parse options method, which takes array, which by default might be empty. And inside of this method, we are going to start if exclamation mark array key exists, and we're looking for PDO colon colon MySQL attribute initial command. That's the one. And then inside of the options argument. So if it does not exist, we are going to add it. So options, and then let's just copy all this. And this will equal to set names UTF-8. I want to make sure that everything, while I'm connected to the database, everything is executed using the UTF-8 character set. You can obviously change it to whichever other character set you might be using for your own project, but UTF-8 is the one I will be using. Okay, then return options. And that's all we need to have in this method. Let's create doc blocks again. And let's put the description, add options to PDO constructor. I think that makes sense. Okay, now here going back to this one, let's quickly specify what sort of data type we're expecting here. Database argument will be of a string type, so string. Then host will be either a string. Yeah, it is going to be a string. Then we have port, which is of an integer type. Username is going to be string as well. Password is a string as well. And options is an array. Okay, so all that's updated. If we run our test, obviously what we've done here isn't changing anything really. So if we run tests, we get exactly the same result because obviously we are using behind the scenes SQLite while testing. So this MySQL isn't going to be used while we're testing. Okay, let's remove this line. I think that's it. So going back to our database manager, what we need to do now is for this MySQL one method, we are going to return new MySQL, and now we need to provide all these options. And I'm going to split them all onto new lines. So if we do like this. Okay, and now let's indent it and semicolon at the end. So the first argument will be .env get method, and we want to get value associated with the variable db database. Next one is going to be .env get, and we want to get db underscore host. Next one will be .env get, and it's going to be port, sorry, db underscore port. The next one is .env get, and it's going to be db user name. And actually we have more, so let's just duplicate this one. Password, db password. And the last one was options. So options. There we go. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 arguments. Quite a few. But hey, that should be working fine here for this specific example. Okay, so you have database, host, port, username, password, and options. Let's just go back to MySQL, database, host, port, username, and password, and options at the end. Okay, so that's all fine. Let's again generate doc blocks here for all three methods. Let's start with the one at the top. get database instance. Next one, this one we can call get SQLite instance, and then get MySQL instance. Okay, get MySQL instance. There we go. So that's all done. Our database manager is now completed. Our database manager, I don't think we need any more tests here. We only need to make sure that we get the database instance, and that's what we've tested for. So we can now, if I just check if we've done everything yet, MySQL 1 is done, SQLite 1 is done as well. Database obviously is something we're going to be working on in the following videos, but database manager file can now be closed, and database manager test also. So in the next video, we're going to be adding to this database class. But before we do this, let's clean up a little bit on the left hand side here. We don't need this database, which was created when we call this SQLite with just a static database name. So let's remove this file, let's remove this license and readme as well. These are not the files that we need here, and I think that's a bit better now. Okay, let's move to the next video.